On my desk. Something about the color." He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air between them. Sarah stared at the image, unable to process the bizarre twist of fate. Her hair had somehow found its way back to David before she had. "So, now what?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "Are you going to offer me the job out of guilt? Or show me the door because I'm a complication you never expected?" David set his phone down carefully, his expression unreadable. "The position is yours if you want it. Not out of guilt, but because you're qualified. Your military experience, medical training, and first-hand understanding of veteran needs make you an ideal candidate." He paused. "As for Ellie, I want to meet my daughter." "It's not that simple," Sarah said, thinking of the tiny, trusting face that had become her entire world. "You can't just walk in and out of her life on a whim. She's not a project you can abandon when it gets difficult." "I know that," David said, a flash of anger crossing his face. "I made a terrible mistake with you, Sarah. I'm not making another one with my child." The intercom buzzed, Ms. Rivera's voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Pierce, your 10 o'clock is waiting." David pressed a button. "Please reschedule all my appointments for today, Camila." He turned back to Sarah. "We have a lot to discuss, and I'm not doing it in a sterile conference room. Have lunch with me, please." Sarah hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk away, to deny him the chance he'd never given her. But the practical part, the mother in her who counted every penny and worried about Ellie's future, knew she couldn't afford that luxury. "I need to check with my babysitter," she said finally. "I can't be gone too long." As she sent a quick text to Mrs. Nguyen, Sarah caught David watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not quite remorse, not quite hope, but something that suggested the carefully constructed walls of his new life were beginning to crack. Little did either of them know that lunch would be just the beginning of a journey that would force them both to confront not only their past, but the people they had become in the aftermath of heartbreak and survival. The restaurant David chose was nothing like the places they'd frequented when they were together. No greasy spoons or campus cafes where they'd once shared dreams over cheap coffee. This was all polished wood, soft lighting, and discreet waitstaff who seemed to materialize only when needed. Sarah sat stiffly in her dress uniform, acutely aware of how out of place she looked among the business attire and casual wealth surrounding them. "You could have warned me about the venue," she said quietly as a waiter filled their water glasses. "I'm not exactly dressed for five-star dining." David's eyes softened slightly. "You look fine, better than fine. The uniform suits you." "It's all I had that qualified as professional," Sarah admitted, hating the vulnerability in her voice. "My civilian clothes don't exactly scream corporate environment these days." Something flickered across David's face, realization, perhaps of how far she had fallen while he had risen. He studied the menu without really seeing it, his knuckles white against the leather binding. "Tell me about her," he finally said, setting the menu aside. "About Ellie." Sarah hesitated, the protective instinct that had developed since motherhood warring with the knowledge that Ellie deserved to know her father, regardless of Sarah's feelings toward him. She was born on May 12th, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. 21 hours of labor. Sarah watched his face carefully. "She had colic for the first 3 months. Cried constantly unless I was holding her. The neighbors complained. I nearly got evicted." David winced. "I'm sorry, I should have been there." "Yes, you should have." Sarah took a sip of water, gathering herself. "She has your smile." "My eyes, but your smile, and your stubbornness. God, help me." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Does she sleep through the night yet?" "Sometimes. When she's not teething or having growth spurts." Sarah pulled out her phone, hesitated, then handed it to him. "This is her." David took the phone, with reverent hands staring at the screen. The photo showed Ellie sitting in a second-hand high chair, applesauce smeared across her chubby cheeks, dark eyes bright with mischief and tiny hands reaching for the camera. His breath caught audibly. "She's beautiful," he whispered, swiping. To see more photos. Each swipe revealed another moment he'd missed: Ellie's first smile, her first time sitting up, her face peaceful in sleep. "I've missed everything." "Not everything," Sarah said, surprising herself with the softness in her voice. "She's still little. There's time." The waiter returned, and David ordered mechanically, his eyes still fixed on the phone. Sarah chose the least expensive item on the menu, old habits dying hard, despite the fact that she wasn't paying. "Where are you living?" David asked after the waiter departed. "Basement apartment in Riverdale. It's not much, but it's what I can afford on my VA. Benefits and odd jobs." "Odd jobs?" The crease between his brows deepened. "What about your military pension?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Have you seen what military pensions amount to these days? And there's been a processing delay with my disability claim. Something about needing more documentation for the shrapnel injury." Her hand unconsciously moved to her lower back. "Meanwhile, I clean houses, stock shelves, whatever I can get that works around Ellie's schedule." David set the phone down carefully. "And your hair? How bad did things have to get for you to sell that?" Sarah looked away, unwilling to let him see how close she was to breaking. "The formula Ellie tolerates is specialized. It's expensive. My last cleaning client canceled, and we were down to half a can." She shrugged, aiming for nonchalance. "It's just hair. It grows back." "Jesus, Sarah." David ran a hand over his face. "Why didn't you reach out to someone? Your parents, your friends from the unit, anyone?" "My parents died while I was deployed, remember? Car accident in 2020. The words still stung to say aloud. "Most of my unit is dealing with their own post-deployment issues. And the rest." She trailed off, thinking of the friends who hadn't made it home. "Well, they're not available for babysitting." Their food arrived, breaking the tension momentarily. Sarah stared at her plate, suddenly ravenous but determined not to show it. She ate carefully, methodically, the way she'd learned in the military, making each bite last, never knowing when the next meal would come. "I've done well," David said after a long silence, as if confessing a sin. "The company took off faster than I expected. We got venture capital backing last year. The prosthetics division has government contracts now." "Congratulations," Sarah said, meaning it despite everything. The David she'd known had always been brilliant, always had potential waiting to be realized. "Looks like leaving me was the best career move you ever made." The barb hit its mark. David flinched. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Sarah set down her fork, finally asking the question that had haunted her sleepless nights. What makes a man leave a note for someone he claimed to love? Not even a conversation, just a coward's goodbye? David's jaw tightened. "I was drowning." "Sarah, you came back from deployment a different person. Withdrawn, angry, jumping at shadows. Nothing I did helped. When I touched you, you flinched. When I asked questions, you shut down. I felt useless, watching you suffer and not knowing how to reach you. I was traumatized," Sarah said quietly. "I watched my friends die. I pulled shrapnel from my own body while treating others. I came home to find out my parents were gone. And then I found out I was pregnant." Her voice broke slightly. "I needed time. I needed patience. I needed a partner who wouldn't bail when things got hard." "I know that now," David said, his voice hollow. "I've had a lot of time to think about it, to regret it. After I left, I threw myself into work. Started the company with my thesis project on neural responsive prosthetics. Expanded into other medical technology. Made my first million by 28. He looked up, his eyes haunted. "And none of it filled the hole where you used to be." Sarah wanted to hold on to her anger. It had kept her warm on cold nights, kept her moving when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. But there was something. In his face now, something raw and honest that made it harder to dismiss him as simply the villain in her story. "What do you want from me, David?" she asked finally. "Absolution? A medal for your regret? Access to the daughter you didn't know existed until an hour ago?" "I want to make it right," he said immediately. "I want to support Ellie financially, emotionally, whatever she needs. I want to be her father if you'll let me. And me?" Sarah asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "What do you want from me?" She had survived war. She had survived childbirth alone. She had survived hunger and cold and despair. She would survive seeing David Pierce again. As she carefully ironed her dress uniform, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't mention Ellie, not right away. She would see if he recognized her first, if there was any flicker of remorse in those dark eyes when he saw what had become of the woman he'd once claimed to love. She would accept the job if offered, would work harder than anyone, would build a better life for Ellie through her own strength. And when the time was right, when she was standing on more solid ground, then David Pierce would learn about the daughter he had never known existed. Sarah hung the uniform on the back of the door and checked on Ellie one last time before crawling into her own bed. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. She touched her short hair again, a reminder of her sacrifice and her strength. Little did she know that across town, in a luxurious penthouse office, David Pierce sat reviewing resumes for tomorrow's interviews, completely unaware that his past was about to collide with his present in ways he could never have imagined. On his desk sat a small glass paperweight containing a single lock of auburn hair, the first sample from a high-end WIG boutique that supplied hair for the medical wigs his company donated to veterans and cancer patients. The same lock of hair Sarah Matthews had sold that very morning. The sleek glass building of Pierce Innovations towered over the surrounding structures, reflecting the morning sunlight like a beacon of success against the gray winter sky. Sarah stood at its base, her freshly pressed army dress uniform hanging slightly loose on her frame, a manila folder containing her resume clutched in trembling fingers. The wind whipped around her exposed neck, an unfamiliar sensation that reminded her of all she had sacrificed to be standing here. "You've faced insurgents and IEDs," she whispered to herself, squaring her shoulders as she approached the revolving doors. "You can face one man who couldn't keep his promises." The lobby gleamed with polished marble and modern art installations that probably cost more than Sarah's entire military pension. A security guard glanced at her uniform with respect, directing her toward a sleek reception desk where a woman with immaculate hair and a practiced smile waited. "Sarah Matthews for the 9 a.m. interview," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Of course, Sergeant Matthews. We're honored to have a veteran applying today," the receptionist replied, glancing at her computer. "Please take the elevator to the 14th floor. Ms. Rivera in HR will meet you." Sarah's stomach churned as the elevator rose silently too. Quickly, bringing her closer to a confrontation she'd both dreaded and fantasized about countless times during sleepless nights with a colicky baby. What would she see in David's eyes? Recognition? Remorse? Or worse, nothing at all? The HR director, a polished woman with kind eyes, greeted Sarah warmly and led her through a series of questions about her military experience, her medical training, her ability to handle stressful situations. Sarah answered automatically, drawing on her years of briefings and debriefings, while her eyes scanned the office for any sign of David. "Your combat medical experience is impressive," Ms. Rivera said, making notes on her tablet. "And the leadership skills you developed as a sergeant would be valuable here." "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied, forcing herself to focus. "I understand Pierce Innovations works with veteran medical care." Ms. Rivera's face brightened. "Yes, it's our founder's passion project. Mr. Pierce has dedicated significant resources to developing advanced prosthetics and rehabilitative technology for wounded veterans. In fact, She checked her watch. He asked to meet all the candidates. For this position personally, he should be joining us shortly. As if summoned by his name, the door opened. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as David Pierce strode in, somehow both familiar and a stranger. The boyish grad student was gone, replaced by a confident executive in a tailored suit that highlighted his broad shoulders. His dark hair was styled differently, shorter on the sides with subtle gray at the temples that hadn't been there before. Success looked good on him. He glanced at Sarah without recognition, his professional smile never faltering as he extended his hand. David Pierce. Thank you for your service, Sergeant. Sarah stood, taking his hand in a firm grip that belied her inner turmoil. His palm was smooth against her calloused fingers' hands that had never changed diapers at 3 a.m. or scrubbed floors to make rent. Sarah Matthews, former combat medic, 68W. She replied evenly, searching his face for any flicker of recognition. 3rd Battalion, 2nd Infantry Division. Nothing. Not even a pause in his practiced smile. Excellent. We're particularly interested in veterans with medical background for this position, he said, taking his seat beside Ms. Rivera. Tell me, what interests you about Pierce Innovations? The absurdity of the situation nearly made Sarah laugh. What interested her? The fact that its CEO had fathered her child and disappeared? That he was now wealthy while she sold pieces of herself to survive? Instead, she pulled from the company research she'd done after putting Ellie to bed. Your advancements in prosthetic limb sensitivity for amputee veterans align with my experience treating combat injuries, she said. I've seen firsthand how improved medical technology can change lives. David nodded, appearing genuinely interested. What was your most challenging medical situation in combat? Sarah's mind flashed to blood-soaked sand, the screams of the wounded, her hands moving automatically while her brain catalogued injuries. An IED hit our convoy outside Kandahar. 3 critical casualties, including spinal injuries and amputations. I had to triage and stabilize alone until evacuation arrived. She didn't mention that she'd been among the wounded, that the shrapnel still lodged near her spine, sometimes sent fire down her right leg when she stood too long. Impressive, David said, making notes. His eyes finally lingered on her face, a slight furrow appearing between his brows. Have we met before, Sergeant Matthews? Sarah's throat tightened. I believe we have, Mr. Pierce. Ms. Rivera glanced between them, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Would you excuse us for a moment, Camila? David asked, his voice carefully neutral. I'd like to discuss Sergeant Matthews' potential fit with our veteran outreach program. Once the door closed behind the HR director, silence filled the room like smoke. David studied her face, recognition slowly dawning in his eyes. Sarah, I didn't. Your hair. Sold it yesterday, she said flatly. Baby formula isn't cheap. The color drained from his face. Baby. Your daughter is 8 months old. Her name is Ellie. Sarah kept her voice clinical, as if delivering a field report. She has your eyes and your dimple when she smiles. She's starting to pull herself up on furniture. She wakes up twice a night. David gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. I didn't know you were pregnant when I left. Would it have mattered? The question hung between them, sharp as broken glass. He looked away first. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you? Sarah's carefully constructed composure cracked. You left a note, David. A note. You changed your number. Your mother told me you'd moved away for a fresh start. How exactly was I supposed to tell you anything? David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Sarah's chest ache despite herself. I thought, after your injury, you seemed so different. Distant. Angry. I couldn't reach you anymore. I had shrapnel in my spine and PTSD, Sarah said, her voice low. I was fighting to recognize myself. I needed support, not abandonment. I was 26 and terrified, he countered. I didn't know how to help you. Everything I did seemed to make it worse. So you left me to face it all alone. Sarah's words fell like stones between them. Do you have any idea what these past 17 months have been like? The disability paperwork, the medical bills, working until my 3rd trimester because the alternative was homelessness, giving birth with only a nurse holding my hand because there was no one else. David's face crumpled, the polished CEO facade. Falling away. I'm sorry. I never imagined ... No, you didn't. Sarah cut him off. You never imagined I'd be sitting across from you in a job interview, desperate enough to sell my hair to feed your child. His eyes widened. You sold your hair yesterday? To which boutique? The strange specificity of the question threw her. Luke's Hair Designs on Briarwood Avenue. Why? David reached for his phone with shaking fingers, pulled up a photo, and turned the screen toward her. There in high definition was a single lock of auburn hair, her resting on black velvet. Our company partners with them to create medical wigs for cancer patients and veterans, he said quietly. They sent me samples of their recent acquisitions yesterday. I keep this one. Sarah stared at him, the revelation shifting her understanding of their past. So you ran. I ran, he agreed, shame evident in his voice. Told myself you deserved better. That the baby deserved better. Then I threw myself into work, desperate. To become someone worthy. By the time I realized what I'd thrown away, I thought it was too late. It nearly was, Sarah said quietly. Another month of struggling, and I might have been forced to move to my cousin's place in Ohio. You never would have found us. The thought seemed to physically pain him. I don't deserve a second chance. I know that. But Ellie deserves a father. And I swear to you, Sarah, I will never abandon her. Or you. Not again. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Sarah studied his face. The same features she'd once known better than her own, now marked by new lines of responsibility and regret. The man who had left her was not entirely the man standing before her now. Whether that difference was enough remained to be seen. I should get some rest, she said finally. Ellie will be up early. David nodded, accepting the gentle dismissal. Good night, Sarah. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. For what it's worth, I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with sleeping Ellie and a confession that complicated everything. Sarah set down her tea and moved to the bedside, watching her daughter's peaceful breathing. Love had never been there. Problem, it was trust that had been broken, and trust that would be the hardest to rebuild. In the quiet darkness, with snow falling gently outside and her daughter sleeping safely nearby, Sarah allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been. Fighting since seeing David again, that beneath her anger and hurt. A part of her heart had never stopped loving him either. Sarah woke to unfamiliar softness and warmth, momentarily disoriented until Ellie's familiar morning babble grounded her. Pale winter sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, illuminating a room that made her basement apartment seem like a distant bad dream. She checked her watch. 6:17 a.m., later than Ellie usually allowed her to sleep. Mama, Ellie called, pulling herself up on the portable crib rails, face brightening at the puzzia. Sight of Sarah. Good morning, sweet girl, Sarah murmured, lifting her daughter and breathing in her warm, sleep-scented hair. Did you sleep well in our fancy room? A soft knock interrupted their morning ritual. Sarah adjusted her borrowed robe before opening the door to find David balancing a tray of coffee and what smelled like freshly baked muffins. I heard voices, he said, looking surprisingly domestic in joggers and a faded Harvard t-shirt. Thought you might want breakfast. His hair was slightly rumpled, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept much. Sarah recognized the look from their graduate school days. David thinking through a problem all night, emerging with either a breakthrough or exhaustion. You bake now? Sarah asked, accepting the tray as Ellie reached curiously for the colorful mug. Double quotes, no. David laughed, the sound warming something inside her she'd thought long frozen. Rosa came in early. She stress bakes when she's excited. Apparently, having a baby in the house qualifies. Ellie squirmed in Sarah's arms, clearly fascinated by this man who kept appearing at the edges of her world. David's eyes lit up as he watched her, hands twitching slightly as if he wanted to reach for her but was restraining himself. Would you like to hold her while I eat? Sarah offered, the word surprising her as much as David. She's usually happy in the mornings. David's careful composure cracked, naked hope flashing across his face. I'd like that very much. The exchange was awkward, Ellie studying David suspiciously as Sarah transferred her. But once settled in his arms, the baby seemed content enough. Reaching up to pat his stubbled cheek with her usual curiosity. I looked into larger apartments, David said as Sarah sipped the excellent coffee. There's a 2-bedroom on the 5th floor of a building I own, 3 blocks from the office. Good security, elevator access, plenty of natural light. Sarah set her mug down carefully. David, just as your employer, he added quickly. Subsidized housing is part of your benefits package. Nothing more complicated than that. Sarah studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. And what happens when things get difficult between us? When we disagree about Ellie's upbringing or have a professional conflict? Would you evict us? Pain flashed across David's face. I deserve that suspicion. But no, the apartment would be yours, regardless of our ... situation. Legally documented. Before Sarah could respond, Ellie began fussing, the universal sign that breakfast was overdue. David looked momentarily panicked. Her formula is in the side pocket of the diaper bag, Sarah instructed, torn between taking over and letting David learn. She needs 6 ounces, warmed slightly. To her surprise, David handled the bottle preparation with unexpected competence, testing the temperature on his wrist exactly as she would have done. I watched videos, he admitted, catching her expression as he settled Ellie back in his arms. With the bottle. Every night this week. Infant care basics, feeding techniques, developmental milestones. I wanted to be prepared. The image of David Pierce, tech innovator and CEO, watching baby care tutorials in his expansive home while Sarah stretched formula with water to make it last longer in her basement apartment, struck her as both touching and infuriating. I spent 3 days learning through trial and error when she was born, Sarah said quietly. No videos, no help. Just me and a newborn and absolute terror that I was doing everything wrong. David's face fell, his gaze fixed on Ellie's contented expression as she drank. I'm sorry, Sarah. More sorry than I can ever express. I don't want your apologies, Sarah said, surprising herself with the calmness in her voice. I want your commitment. Not to me, that's a separate issue entirely, but to her. No matter what. You have it, David replied without hesitation. I've already changed my will, established a trust. Even if something happens to me, she'd be taken care of. He hesitated. And you too, as her mother. The conversation was interrupted by Ellie finishing her bottle with a satisfied sigh, immediately beginning to squirm for freedom. David looked to Sarah for guidance. She need burping, then she want to explore, Sarah explained, rising to take her daughter. I should get her changed and dressed. We've imposed on your hospitality enough. It's not an imposition, David said quickly, reluctantly surrendering Ellie. It's the highlight of my week, month, year. The naked honesty in his voice made Sarah pause. She'd expected corporate David controlled, strategic, perhaps calculating in his approach to this unexpected fatherhood. Instead, she kept glimpsing the man she'd once loved, earnest and vulnerable beneath the successful exterior. We need to establish a routine, she said finally, for Ellie's sake. Regular visits, consistent schedules. Children need stability. Hope flared in David's eyes. I'd like that, very much. As Sarah gathered their things, preparing to return to her reality beyond this brief respite in David's world, she couldn't help noticing how naturally he moved around Ellie, how his entire focus narrowed to their daughter's needs. The anger she'd nursed for months hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, making room for the possibility that people could change, that David had changed. Whether that change was enough remained to be seen. Weeks blended into a carefully orchestrated routine. Sarah excelled at Pierce Innovations, her military experience and first-hand understanding of combat injuries, bringing authenticity to the veteran outreach program. David maintained professional boundaries at work while gradually building a relationship with Ellie through evening visits and weekend mornings at the park. Their interactions grew less strained, evolving into a tentative co-parenting arrangement that prioritized Ellie's needs above their complicated history. Sarah had declined the apartment David offered, too wary of becoming dependent on him again. Instead, she found a modest one-bedroom within her new salary range, a significant upgrade from the basement, with actual windows and a small balcony where Ellie could feel the sun. David respected her decision while finding other ways to contribute, establishing a college fund and ensuring Ellie had everything she needed without overstepping Sarah's boundaries. The fragile peace between them held until a Tuesday afternoon in March, when Sarah's phone rang during a meeting with potential investors. David watched her face transform as she answered, color draining from her cheeks. "I'll be right there," she said, already gathering her things. "How high is her fever?" David was at her side instantly, investor presentation forgotten. "What's wrong?" "Ellie's sick. The daycare called 104-degree fever, lethargic, not responding normally." Sarah's voice remained steady, but her hands shook as she collected her laptop. "I need to get her to the doctor." Ellie beamed, accepting this information with the confidence of a child who had always known she was valued. She had no memory of the basement apartment, the desperate days when her mother had sold her hair to buy formula. To her, the foundation was simply part of their family story, as natural as her father's prosthetics company or her mother's military past. They continued their walk toward the administration building where the day's board meeting would soon begin. Today's agenda included approving funding for 3 new satellite centers and finalizing the scholarship program for veterans' children. What had begun as one woman's desperate act had spawned a movement that would outlast them all. "Major Coleman sent an update on Rivera," Sarah said as they walked. "She's completed her surgical fellowship. Wants to head up the medical division at our Phoenix Center." David nodded approvingly. The burn specialist? Perfect choice. Staff Sergeant Rivera, now Dr. Rivera, had been the first recipient of Sarah's donated hair years ago. The young veteran had not only recovered from her injuries, but had gone on to medical school with the foundation's support, determined to help others with battlefield trauma. Her journey from wounded warrior to healer embodied everything the foundation stood for. As they approached the building, Sarah paused, gazing back at the path they had traveled, not just today's garden walk, but the longer journey from that cold January morning when she had sold her hair in desperation. The memory no longer brought pain, only perspective. "Sometimes I think about how close we came to missing all of this," she said quietly. "If I hadn't taken that job interview, if you hadn't recognized me, if we hadn't found a way forward together." David's free arm circled her waist, drawing her close. "I prefer to think it was inevitable, that some connections can bend and strain, but never truly break." Ellie, always alert to her parents' moments of reflection, slipped her small hand into her mother's. "Is that why you keep the hair necklace in your special box, Mom? To remember?" Sarah smiled, touching the spot where the pendant had once rested against her skin. Now it lived in a keepsake box with other treasures. Ellie's first lost tooth, James's hospital bracelet, The simple note David had written when he proposed a second time, properly, on bended knee. I keep it to remember that endings can become beginnings, she told her daughter. And that sometimes, the things we think we're losing are just transforming into something new. The foundation bell tolled, calling the board members to assembly. David pressed a kiss to Sarah's temple before taking James from his shoulders, ready to change a few more lives today. Sarah looked at her family, the husband who had learned to stay, the children who would grow up knowing both struggle and purpose, the community they had built from their broken pieces, and nodded. Always. 10 years to the day since Sarah had walked into that wig boutique. She stood before a crowd of hundreds at the National Veterans Recognition Ceremony. The program listed her as keynote speaker, Colonel Sarah Matthews Pierce, RET, founder of the Matthews Pierce Foundation. But titles had never mattered less to her than the work itself. As she approached the podium, her gaze found David in the front row, gray now prominent at his temples, his eyes still holding the same love they had rekindled over a decade ago. Beside him sat their children, Ellie, now 12 and already talking about medical school, James, 8 and fascinated by prosthetic engineering, and 5-year-old Maya, named for the combat medic who had saved Sarah's life in Afghanistan. My journey began with an act of desperation, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the hushed auditorium. Selling my hair to feed my baby daughter. She touched the pendant she wore today, that preserved lock of auburn hair, now a symbol of transformation rather than sacrifice. What I couldn't see then was that my lowest moment would become the foundation for something greater than myself. In the audience, hundreds of veterans and their families listened, many whose lives had been directly changed by the foundation born from that moment of need. We are all just one act of compassion away from transformation, Sarah concluded, her eyes meeting David's across the distance. One moment of grace from a new beginning. You're watching Soul Stories, where every story whispers of hope, healing, and second chances. If this journey from desperation to destiny touched your heart, join our community by subscribing. Share in the comments how an act of kindness changed your life, because every story matters, especially yours. Stay with U.S. More journeys of transformation await on Soul Stories, where broken pieces become beautiful beginnings. I'm coming with you, David said, no room for argument in his tone. Jenkins can finish the presentation. They rode the elevator in tense silence, Sarah's military training visibly kicking in, emotions contained, mind focused on the mission. David had seen this shift before during her deployments, the way she compartmentalized fear into action. It had once made him feel shut out. Now he recognized it as her strength. The daycare director met them at the entrance, Ellie already bundled. In her winter clothes, her normally bright eyes glassy with fever. She whimpered softly at the sight of Sarah, reaching with listless arms. She was fine at breakfast, the director explained, but spiked a fever during morning nap. We called as soon as we realized how high it was. Sarah gathered Ellie against her chest, medical training taking over as she assessed her daughter's symptoms. Her breathing is labored. How long has she been like this? Less than an hour. It came on suddenly. David had already called his driver, who waited at the curb. Children's Hospital is 12 minutes away. My pediatrician friend is meeting us there. Sarah didn't question how he'd arranged this so quickly, simply sliding into the car with Ellie clutched against her. David followed, instructing the driver to use emergency routes. You have a pediatrician friend? Sarah asked, pressing her lips to Ellie's forehead to gauge her temperature. I called in a favor, David admitted. Dr. Chun leads our pediatric prosthetics division. Her husband is chief of pediatrics at Children's. In the hospital, Sarah's military bearing and David's influence created an efficient path through typically slow emergency room procedures. Dr. Chun's husband examined Ellie. Immediately, ordering tests and 4 fluids while explaining his concerns about possible pneumonia. "The chest X-ray shows fluid in her lungs," he explained gently. "We need to admit her for 4 antibiotics and monitoring." Sarah nodded, clinical and focused, only the white-knuckled grip on Ellie's tiny hand betraying her fear. David stood slightly apart, unsure of his place in this crisis, but unwilling to leave. Hours passed in the pediatric ward. Ellie finally sleeping after medication brought her fever down. Sarah sat beside the hospital crib, still in her work clothes, refusing to leave even to eat or change. "You should rest," David said softly, returning with coffee from the cafeteria. "I can watch her while you take a break." Sarah shook her head. "I need to be here when she wakes up." "I know." David set the coffee on the side table. "But you're no good to her exhausted." "We can take shifts." The "we" hung between them, presumptuous perhaps, but also right. Whatever their past, in this moment, they were united by shared fear for their daughter. "When I was deployed," Sarah said suddenly, her voice low, "I treated a little Afghan girl, maybe 3 years old. Fever, respiratory distress. We didn't have the right equipment, the right medicines. She died in my arms while her mother watched." She looked up at David, vulnerability breaking through her composed exterior. "I can't. That won't happen here," David said firmly, moving to her side. "Ellie has the best doctors, every resource. And she has us, both of us." Sarah's control finally cracked, a single sob escaping before she could suppress it. Without thinking, David pulled her against him, her head finding the familiar spot against his shoulder, as if their bodies remembered a connection their minds still questioned. "I was so scared," she whispered against his shirt. "When they called, all I could think was not her. Please, not her." "I know," David murmured into her hair. "Me too." They stayed that way as darkness settled outside the hospital windows. 2 people brought together by a child, by fear, by the realization that some connections never truly break. When Ellie stirred in her sleep, they both moved to check on her, hands brushing in the space above her crib. "You should sleep," David said again, more gently. "Take the recliner. I'll keep watch from the chair." This time Sarah nodded, too exhausted to argue. As she drifted into uneasy sleep, the last thing she saw was David sitting vigilant beside their daughter's crib, his fingers lightly touching Ellie's small hand, his eyes never leaving her face. 3 days blended together in the pediatric ward, marked by shift changes, medication schedules, and the slow improvement in Ellie's condition. The pneumonia responded to antibiotics, her fever gradually subsiding, her breathing becoming less labored. Sarah and David fell into an unspoken rhythm, one napping while the other kept watch, trading places without discussion, united in their vigil. On the morning of the 4th day, Ellie's doctor pronounced her well enough to go home, though she would need continued medication and monitoring. The question of which home wasn't addressed until they stood in the hospital parking lot, the spring sunlight feeling foreign after days under fluorescent lights. "You're both coming to my place," David said, helping the nurse settle a drowsy Ellie into her car seat. "You haven't slept properly in days, and your apartment is a 4th-floor walk-up." Sarah wanted to argue, to maintain the independence she'd fought for, but exhaustion and practicality won out. "Just until she's fully recovered," she conceded, at David's brownstone. Rosa had transformed the guest bedroom into a makeshift nursery, complete with a proper crib, humidifier, and monitoring system. The housekeeper took one look at Sarah's haggard face and insisted on taking Ellie while Sarah showered. "You need rest too, Mama," Rosa said firmly. "The baby knows when you're exhausted." The hot water felt like salvation, washing away hospital antiseptic and fierce sweat. Sarah stood under the spray until her legs trembled with fatigue, then wrapped herself in the plush robe David had left hanging on the door. When she emerged, she found him in the nursery, Ellie sleeping peacefully in the crib while he sat nearby. Laptop open, but ignored as he watched their daughter breathe. The doctor called with her latest test results, he said softly as Sarah entered. Everything's improving. No complications. Sarah sank into the chair opposite him, relief making her limbs heavy. Thank you for everything. I don't think I could have handled this alone. You won't have to, David replied, the simple promise carrying weight beyond Ellie's illness. Not anymore. Sleep claimed Sarah almost instantly, deep and dreamless. When she woke, disoriented and groggy, the bedside clock showed she'd been unconscious for nearly 14 hours. Panic surged through her as she remembered Ellie's illness, sending her stumbling toward the nursery. Before she was fully awake, the scene that greeted her stopped her in the doorway. David sat in the rocking chair, Ellie awake and alert in his lap, her color much improved as she babbled at the picture book he was reading. His voice shifted for each character, a gruff bear, a squeaky mouse drawing delighted giggles from their daughter. Neither noticed Sarah watching from the threshold, witnessing this moment of ordinary parenting magic that she'd once believed would never exist. The man who had left a note and disappeared had become the father, reading Goodnight Moon with animated dedication as she glanced at her watch. 5:17 in the morning. How long has she been awake? Sarah asked, finally entering. David looked up, his smile genuine with none of the caution that usually tempered his expressions around her. About an hour. Her fever's gone, and she kept down some applesauce earlier. You should have woken me. You needed rest, he said simply, and I wanted time with her. Ellie spotted Sarah and reached for her with excited recognition, temporarily abandoning the book. Mama. The next few days established a new normal, Ellie recovering her strength with the resilience of childhood, David working remotely to stay close, Sarah gradually relaxing her hypervigilance as her daughter improved. The brownstone felt increasingly less like David's space and more like a shared territory, their separate routines overlapping into something resembling family life. On Ellie's first evening without fever, Sarah found David in his home office, reviewing design specifications for the pediatric prosthetics division. He'd clearly been at it for hours, empty coffee cups and discarded sketches surrounding his workspace. The doctor says she can probably go home tomorrow, Sarah said, leaning against the doorframe. Back to our apartment, I mean. David set down his pencil, disappointment flashing across his face before he masked it with a nod. Of course. I'm glad she's feeling better. That's it. Sarah raised an eyebrow. No argument about stairs or monitoring or how your place is better. Equipped? A tired smile touched his lips. Would it change your mind if I did? Probably not, Sarah admitted. But it's unlike you not to try. David leaned back in his chair, studying her with unexpected frankness. I'm learning to respect your boundaries, Sarah. You've built a life for yourself and Ellie despite everything. I admire that more than I can say. The simple acknowledgement of her struggle, her accomplishment, her right to independence, touched something deep in Sarah's chest. This was the respect she'd needed from him all along, not just his regret or his resources. The apartment feels empty after being here, she found herself saying. Ellie likes the space to crawl, and she's gotten attached to Rosa. Hope flickered in David's eyes, quickly tempered. You're both welcome to stay as long as you want. No pressure, no expectations. Sarah moved further into the office, fingering the edge of a blueprint spread across his desk. What would you expect, David, if I said yes? He looked up at her. Vulnerability plain on his face, a chance. Not to erase what happened, but to build something new. For Ellie's sake, and maybe ... for ours. The honesty in his voice resonated with something shifting inside her, not forgiveness exactly, but the recognition that holding onto anger served no one, least of all Ellie. Their daughter deserved parents who could move forward, even if the path wasn't clear yet. I'm not ready to move in permanently, Sarah said carefully. But maybe we could stay through the weekend, see how it goes. David's smile was worth the risk of those words, genuine, hopeful, without calculation or reservation. I'd like that very much. In the nursery down the hall, Ellie slept peacefully, unaware that her parents were cautiously laying the foundation for a future none of them could have imagined when Sarah walked into Pierce Innovations with her newly shorn hair and desperate need for a job. 1 year later, the rooftop garden of Pierce Innovations bloomed with streamers and balloons. Employees mingled with family members, all gathered to celebrate the opening of the Sarah Matthews Veteran Center, a state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility for wounded warriors transitioning to civilian life. Sarah stood at the podium in her dress uniform, medals gleaming in the spring sunshine, her auburn hair finely grown out to brush her shoulders. "This center represents everything I wished for when I came home," she said, her voice steady and clear. "A place that understands both the visible and invisible wounds of service. A community that supports not just recovery, but rebuilding." From the front row, David watched with undisguised pride. Ellie perched on his shoulders to see her mother speak. At 20 months, their daughter was a whirlwind of energy and determination, already forming simple sentences and testing boundaries with gleeful abandon. "When I sold my hair last year to buy formula for my daughter," Sarah continued, a ripple of surprise moving through the audience, "I couldn't imagine standing here today. I was surviving hour by hour, a wounded veteran with few options and fewer resources." Her eyes found David's in the crowd. "Sometimes life brings us full circle in ways we never expect." After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, as guests toured the facility with its cutting-edge prosthetics lab and family-centered counseling spaces, Sarah found a quiet moment in her new office. The plaque on the door still felt surreal. Sarah Matthews, Executive Director. From selling her hair for baby food to running a multi-million-dollar veterans program, the journey seemed impossible, and yet here she was. "Quite a view," David said from the doorway, Ellie now dozing against his shoulder, party excitement having finally overtaken her. "You can see the whole city from here." Sarah smiled, making room for him on the window seat, including that wig boutique on Briarwood. Full circle indeed. Their relationship had evolved in careful stages over the past year, from cautious co-parenting to friendship, from friendship to dating again, this time with the weight of experience and a child between them. They had not rushed. David still lived in his brownstone. Sarah and Ellie had a garden apartment 2 blocks away, close enough for daily involvement, separate enough to maintain the independence Sarah had fought for. "I have something for you," David said, shifting Ellie gently as he reached into his pocket. A center-opening gift. The small velvet box wasn't what Sarah expected, not a ring, but a delicate glass pendant containing what she immediately recognized as a lock of auburn hair, identical to the one David had kept on his desk. "My hair," she whispered, touching the pendant with reverent fingers. "I had it preserved before the boutique processed the rest," David admitted. "I didn't know it was yours then, but something about the color. I couldn't let them use it all." Sarah held the pendant to the light, watching the strands catch the sun, a physical reminder of her darkest moment, now transformed into something beautiful. "I kept it because it reminded me of someone I thought I'd lost," David continued quietly. "Now it represents what we found instead." Sarah closed her fingers around the pendant, emotions tightening her throat. Their journey wasn't a fairy tale. They still argued, still navigated the complicated terrain of their past, still attended couples therapy to build healthier patterns. But they had discovered something neither had expected: the capacity to build something stronger from broken pieces. "The center was approved for Phase 2 funding," David said, changing the subject as he sensed her emotion. "The family housing units can break ground next month." Sarah nodded, composing herself. "Just in time. Jenkins and his wife are expecting their second child. They'll need the larger unit." Their conversation, once filled with caution and old wounds, now flowed with the ease of partners who had chosen to face forward together. Not perfect, not without scars, but intentional in every step. As they prepared to rejoin the celebration, Sarah fastened the pendant around her neck, a reminder not of sacrifice, but of survival. Of how far she had come from that desperate woman, selling her hair for her daughter's formula. Of how life could circle back with unexpected grace. "Ready?" David asked, adjusting sleeping Ellie against his shoulder. Sarah touched the pendant one last time, then nodded. "Ready." Together, they stepped back into the sunlight, toward the future they were building, not despite their broken past, but because of what they had learned by mending it. 2 years to the day after Sarah had walked into Pierce Innovations with her shorn hair and desperate need for a job. She stood in the center of what was now their home, not David's brownstone or her separate apartment, but a place they had chosen together. The renovation had taken 6 months, transforming the historic townhouse into a space that honored both their needs. David's home office with its wall of windows, Sarah's therapy room where she counseled veterans, and Ellie's playroom filled with sunlight and laughter. Morning light filtered through stained glass panels they'd salvaged from an old hospital chapel, casting prisms of color across the hardwood floors. Sarah moved through the quiet house, coffee in hand, savoring these moments before Ellie woke and the day's momentum began. At nearly 3, their daughter had become a force of nature, curious, determined, and possessing a fierce independence that both challenged and delighted her parents. From the kitchen window, Sarah could see the memorial garden they'd planted last fall blooming now with early spring flowers, each section dedicated to someone lost. A corner for her parents, taken too soon in a car accident. A section for David's mentor, whose belief in his neural prosthetics research had funded his first prototypes. And the largest area, filled with forget-me-nots and poppies, honoring the members of Sarah's unit who hadn't made it home. "You're up early," David said, his voice still rough with sleep as he joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. The simple intimacy of the gesture still surprised her sometimes, how they had found their way back to each other, through all the pain and distance. "Couldn't sleep," Sarah admitted, leaning back against him, "thinking about everything." David pressed a kiss to her temple, understanding without explanation. They had marked this anniversary last year with quiet acknowledgement, both still navigating the complex emotions that came with rebuilding. This year felt different, less raw, more grateful. "The Matthews Center placement numbers came in yesterday," he said, reaching around her for his own coffee. 87 veterans successfully transitioned to civilian employment through the program. Jenkins says the housing units are at full capacity. Sarah smiled, professional pride warming her chest. What had begun as a rehabilitation facility had expanded into a comprehensive support system housing, job training, family counseling, and childcare designed specifically for veterans. Unique needs. The model was being replicated in 3 other cities, with Sarah consulting on each new location. "We need to expand the child care center," she noted. "There's a 6-month waiting list now. Already in the works." The board approved the funding last week. David's thumb traced absent circles on her arm, the unconscious affection of someone who had earned the right to such casual touches. "I was waiting for the right moment to tell you." Their professional partnership had evolved alongside their personal one, each strengthening the other. Sarah's first-hand understanding of veterans' needs guided David's innovations, while his business acumen and resources gave her ideas the foundation to become reality. They challenged each other, disagreed sometimes, but always with respect that had been missing before. A small voice called from upstairs, ending their quiet moment. "Mommy, Daddy." "I'm awake now. Perfect timing," David laughed. "I'll get her." "You finish your coffee." Sarah watched him take the stairs 2 at a time, eager as always for those first morning moments with Ellie. Their daughter's delighted squeals echoed down the stairwell, followed by David's deeper laughter. The sounds of family, something Sarah had once believed forever beyond her reach, today was significant for another reason, one David didn't yet know about. After their morning routine and dropping Ellie at preschool, Sarah had plans that would change everything once again. 3 hours later, Sarah stood in the private room at Luke's Hair Designs, the same boutique where she had once sold her hair in. Desperation. The owner, an elegant woman named Vivian, greeted her with warm recognition. "Ms. Matthews, so good to see you again. Everything is prepared as you requested." Sarah nodded, a mix of emotions tightening her chest as she surveyed the room. A salon chair faced away from the mirror, draped with a silver cape. Beside it stood a small table with professional scissors and combs. Along the back wall, framed certificates documented the boutique's partnership with the Matthews Center, where they now provided free wigs to female veterans recovering from combat injuries and trauma. "Is she here?" Sarah asked, checking her. "Watch. Just arrived," Vivian confirmed. Nervous but ready. The door opened to reveal a young woman in her early 20s, her military bearing evident despite civilian clothes. Burn scars covered the right side of her face, extending into her scalp where hair would never grow again. Staff Sergeant Melissa Rivera, the newest recipient of the Matthews Pierce Foundation's rehabilitation program. "Sergeant Matthews," Rivera sighed, automatically straightening to attention before catching herself. "I mean, Director Matthews." "Sarah is fine," she replied, extending her hand. "Thank you for agreeing to this." Rivera's eyes darted to the salon chair, understanding dawning. "You're really doing this for my wig?" "It seems fitting," Sarah said, touching her own hair now grown past her shoulders again, thick and healthy. "My hair once helped me when I had nothing. Now it can help you start fresh." As Vivian prepared to cut Sarah's hair, not all of it, this time just enough to create a custom hairpiece for the young sergeant, the door opened again. David stood in the entrance, Ellie at his side, both carrying small bouquets of spring flowers. "Sorry we're late," he said, taking in the scene. With understanding in his eyes, someone insisted on picking the flowers herself. Ellie approached Rivera with solemn curiosity, offering her tiny bouquet. "These are for you. Daddy says you're a hero like Mommy." The young sergeant knelt to accept the flowers' visible emotion, tightening her scarred features. "Thank you, sweetie." David moved to Sarah's side, his hand finding hers as she took her place in the salon chair. "You didn't tell me you were doing this today. I wanted it to be right," Sarah explained. 2 years exactly, from desperation to donation. As Vivian draped the cape around Sarah's shoulders, David leaned down to whisper in her ear, "I've never been more proud to be your husband." The simple gold band on Sarah's finger caught the light 6 months married now in a small ceremony. At the Veterans Center garden, surrounded by the community they'd built together. Not a fairy tale ending, but something better, a real one, hard-earned and honest. The first snip of scissors releasing auburn strands felt like completion of a circle. This time, Sarah's hair wasn't a sacrifice born of desperation, but a gift given freely from abundance. This time, David stood beside her, holding Ellie's hand as they witnessed her choice. This time, the hair would help another warrior find her way home. "Full circle," David murmured, echoing her thoughts as he always seemed to do now. Sarah met his eyes in the mirror and smiled. "No, forward spiral. We don't end up where we started. We end up somewhere better." As the transformed strands fell around her, Sarah felt the final weights of their difficult past release. They had built something neither of them could have imagined that desperate January morning when she had first walked into the wig boutique. Not just a family or a foundation, but a testament to the possibility that broken things, when mended with care and intention, could become stronger at the fractures. 5 years had passed since that fateful day, when a desperate young veteran had sold her hair to feed her child. The Matthews Pierce Foundation now occupied an entire floor of the Pierce Innovations building, its reach extending to veterans programs across 12 states. What had begun as a single rehabilitation center had blossomed into a nationwide movement, changing how America welcomed its warriors home. Ellie, now 7 and in 2nd grade, skipped ahead of her parents along the tree-lined path of the memorial garden that had become the heart of the foundation's main campus. Her dark hair, so like her father's, bounced in 2 braids as she pointed out new spring blooms to her little brother, 3-year-old James, who toddled determinedly after his big sister. "Slow down, you two," Sarah called, one hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their 3rd child grew. At 4 months pregnant, she had finally agreed to step back from day-to-day operations, focusing instead on the foundation's long-term vision while nurturing the new life within her. David walked beside her, his hand comfortably entwined with hers, occasionally steadying her on the uneven garden path. The years had added distinguished touches of silver at his temples, laughter lines around his eyes that spoke of joy reclaimed and deepened. "Remember our first fundraiser here?" he asked, as they approached the central plaza where donors' names were engraved in stone pavers. "When you insisted we invite the veterans to speak instead of corporate sponsors?" Sarah smiled at the memory. The board nearly had a collective heart attack. Then Rodriguez told his story and opened his wallet, and suddenly everyone was writing checks. "You've always understood what people really need," David said softly. "To be seen, to have their struggles acknowledged." They paused at the garden centerpiece, a sculpture commissioned for the foundation's 5th anniversary. A woman stood with her head held high, one hand extended in offering, the other supporting a child. The artist had captured Sarah's essence without creating a literal portrait, honoring her wish for anonymity while symbolizing the foundation's mission. At the sculpture's base, a plaque bore the words that had become their guiding principle: "From moments of greatest need come our greatest strengths." Ellie ran back to them, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom! The new building has my name on it." The Eleanor Matthews Pierce Children's Center stood on the eastern edge of the campus, a bright, modern building designed specifically for the children of wounded veterans. Inside, trained counselors helped young ones understand their parents' visible and invisible injuries, while providing the specialized support military families often struggled to find. "That's because you inspired it," David told his daughter, lifting James onto his shoulders as the boy began to tire. "Before you were born, no one had thought about how important it was to help the whole family heal." Sergeant Matthews was with the 3rd Battalion in Kandahar, David explained as they moved to the dining room, where Rosa had laid out an impressive spread. "She has first-hand experience with field trauma care." "Kandahar in 2020? asked Rodriguez, the oldest of the 3 veterans. "That was rough territory. You must have seen some action." Sarah nodded, the familiar weight of those memories pressing against her chest. "Our convoy hit an IED. 3 critical casualties, multiple injuries, including my own." Martinez, adjusting his prosthetic leg under the table, leaned forward. "That's what got me too. IED outside Mosul. Woke up in Germany missing a leg and wondering, what the hell happened?" As dinner progressed, the conversation flowed more easily than Sarah had anticipated. The veterans discussed their experiences with Pierce Innovations prosthetics, the advances that had improved their quality of life, and the frustrations they still encountered. Sarah found herself engaged, asking questions, sharing insights from her medical training that might help refine the technology. Through it all, she kept one eye on the baby monitor, where Ellie had fallen asleep surrounded by toys. And she couldn't help noticing how David listened intently to every veteran's concern, taking notes, asking thoughtful follow-up questions that showed genuine care rather than corporate interest. "The neural response time still lags when I'm tired," Jenkins explained, demonstrating with his prosthetic arm. "By the end of the day, The movement gets jerky. David nodded, making a note. We're working on that in the next generation. The sensors need to adjust for fluctuations in user energy levels. What about temperature sensitivity? Sarah asked. Many of my patients struggled with prosthetics in extreme heat or cold. That's actually where we've made the most progress, David replied. Animation lighting his features as he explained the thermal regulation technology his team had developed. Watching him in this element passionate about helping people like her former comrades, Sarah felt a confusing mix of emotions. This was not the callous man who had left a note and disappeared. This was someone who had channeled his intellect into making life better for wounded warriors. You really care about this, she said quietly as the veterans moved to the living room for coffee. David met her gaze directly. It started as distraction, honestly. Work to lose myself in after I left, he hesitated. But then I met Jenkins. At a tech conference, heard his story. Realized I could actually do something meaningful with all these ideas I'd been developing. The baby monitor lit up with movement as Ellie began to stir, saving Sarah from having to respond. I should check on her. Do you mind if I come? David asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the hope in his eyes. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. This was what she'd agreed to, after all, letting David be Ellie's father. Whatever other complications existed between them, they found Ellie awake but content, babbling to herself and reaching for the mobile hanging above the playpen. May I? David asked, hands hovering uncertainly at the edge of the playpen. Sarah stepped back, giving him space. Go ahead. With reverent care, David lifted Ellie into his arms, supporting her head even though she was well past needing it. Hey there, little one, he said softly. Did you have a good nap? Ellie reached for his face, a habit that seemed to fascinate her, tiny fingers exploring the contours of his jaw. Then, to both their surprise, she broke into a dimpled smile and patted his cheek with deliberate gentleness. She likes you, Sarah said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. She has good taste, David replied with a shadow of his old humor, though his eyes remained serious, fixed on his daughter's face. She's perfect, Sarah. Absolutely perfect. After the veterans departed, the house settled into a strange, intimate quiet. David had convinced Sarah to let Ellie stay up a little past her bedtime, the three of them sitting on the living room floor while Ellie demonstrated her newest skill, pulling herself up on furniture and cruising along the edge of the coffee table with uncertain steps. She be walking before we know it, David said, hovering nearby to catch her if she toppled. She's determined. Gets that from both of us, Sarah replied, watching as Ellie babbled triumphantly, reaching for a soft toy just beyond her grasp. Stubborn to a fault, Rosa had discreetly disappeared to the kitchen, leaving them in this bubble of tentative family normalcy that felt both foreign and achingly familiar to Sarah. She had imagined moments like this during her pregnancy. David, beaming with pride at their child's accomplishments, the three of them building a life together. The reality was more complicated, layered with hurt and absence that couldn't be erased by one evening of civility. I've been thinking about arrangements, David said carefully, steadying Ellie as she wobbled. Financially, I mean. Child support. Of course, but also setting up a trust for her education, her future. Sarah stiffened slightly. We're managing. I know you are, David replied, catching the defensiveness in her tone. That's not ... I'm not implying you're not taking care of her. I just want to contribute. It's my responsibility. Now it is, Sarah couldn't help saying, the words sharper than she intended. David's face fell, but he didn't argue. I deserve that, and 1,000 more like it. He gently guided Ellie back to a sitting position as she began to tire. I can't change what I did, Sarah. I can only try to be better going forward. Ellie yawned widely, her eyelids growing heavy, blissfully, unaware of the tension between her parents. Sarah checked her watch, nearly 2 hours past bedtime. I should get her home, she said, reaching for the diaper bag. She gets cranky if her routine is disrupted too much. My driver can take you, David offered, then hesitated. Or you could stay, both of you. There's a guest room with an adjoining office I could convert to a nursery. We could draw up plans for something more permanent next week. The presumption startled her. David, we work together. You're Ellie's father. That doesn't mean we're picking up where we left off. That's not what I meant, he said quickly, though something in his eyes suggested otherwise. I just thought, it's late, it's cold, the guest room has its own bathroom. Practical, not presumptuous, Sarah considered the offer. The thought of bundling Ellie into a car, then carrying her and all their things down to the cold basement apartment was admittedly unappealing. And there was something to be said for seeing how David handled a fussy baby at 5 a.m. One night, she conceded. But I didn't bring anything for tomorrow. Rosa can wash what you're wearing overnight, David replied, clearly relieved. And I might have something you can sleep in. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in a guest bedroom larger than her entire apartment. Ellie already asleep in a portable crib David had somehow procured on short notice. She stood at the window, wrapped in a soft robe that smelled faintly of cedar, watching snowflakes begin to drift from the night sky. A gentle knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. David stood in the hallway, keeping a respectful distance, holding a steaming mug. Rosa made chamomile tea before she left for the night, he explained. Thought you might want some. Sarah accepted the mug, inhaling the soothing aroma. Thank you. David glanced past her to where Ellie slept peacefully. She went down easily. She was exhausted. All the excitement, new people. Sarah sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. She'd probably be up at dawn to make up for it. I'll be up, David said quietly. I'm an early riser these days, work habit. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Sarah could feel David's eyes on her face, searching for something, forgiveness perhaps, or some sign that the wall between them might someday come down. Why did you really leave, David? She asked suddenly, the question that had haunted her for months finally finding voice. The real reason, not the explanation that makes you feel less guilty. David's breath caught, his carefully maintained composure cracking. He moved to the window beside her, looking out at the falling snow rather than meeting her eyes. I was afraid, he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. Not of your PTSD or your injuries, of failing you. He pressed his palm against the cool glass. You came back from war a hero who had faced death and saved lives. I was just a struggling grad student with big ideas and no follow-through. When you found out you were pregnant, I panicked. What kind of father would I be when I couldn't even figure out my thesis project? What could I possibly offer a child? David hesitated, caution in his eyes. I want to help you too. The job is real, and it's yours if you want it. Good salary, benefits, flexible hours. But I understand if you can't stand the thought of seeing me every day. I can't afford pride. Sarah said simply, Ellie needs stability more than I need distance from you. Relief washed over his face. Then you'll take the job? On one condition, Sarah said, meeting his gaze steadily. This stays professional. Whatever we were to each other before, now we're co-workers. And you're Ellie's father, yes, but that doesn't automatically make us a family. Trust has to be earned back, David. It doesn't just reappear because you feel guilty. David nodded slowly. I understand. Professional boundaries. I can respect that. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, scribbling something on the back. This is my personal number. When you're ready, I'd like to meet Ellie, on your terms, your timeline. Sarah took the card, her fingers brushing his briefly. The familiar contact sent an unwelcome jolt through her system, a reminder of the connection they'd once shared, now buried under layers of hurt and absence. I should get back, she said, glancing at her watch. Mrs. Nguyen has her doctor's appointment at 2. Of course, David signaled for the check. When can you start the job? Monday, Sarah said after a moment's consideration. I need to arrange childcare for Ellie. We have an on-site daycare for employees, David said, his tone carefully neutral. State-of-the-art facilities, trained staff. It's a benefit I insisted on when we expanded last year. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that he'd created a family-friendly workplace while being oblivious to his own child's existence. Still, the prospect of having Ellie nearby during workdays, of saving on childcare costs, was too practical to dismiss out of pride. I'll think about it, she said, rising from her chair. Thank you for lunch. As she walked away, Sarah felt David's eyes on her back watching her go, perhaps the way she had once watched him leave. The difference was she knew she would return. On Monday, uniform exchanged for whatever professional clothes she could cobble together over the weekend. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning, complicated, painful, but possibly the path to the stability Ellie deserved. What Sarah couldn't see was the way. David's composed expression crumbled once she was out of sight, or how he sat alone at the table long after she'd gone, staring at the photos of his daughter on his phone, with tears tracking silently down his face. Monday morning arrived with a mix of apprehension and determination that reminded Sarah of her first day of basic training. She stood before the small cracked mirror in her bathroom, hardly recognizing herself in the clothes she'd purchased from a second-hand store over the weekend. Simple navy skirt suit that had required minor alterations to fit her diminished frame. She'd used some of her dwindling cash reserve for the outfit, a calculated investment in her future. What do you think, Ellie? She asked, turning to where her daughter sat in her bouncer, chewing contentedly on a teething ring. Does Mama look like she belongs in a fancy office? Ellie responded with a drooly grin that melted Sarah's heart and strengthened her resolve. This job wasn't just about her pride or her history with David. It was about creating a stable future for the little girl who deserved so much more than a basement apartment and second-hand everything. The Nguyens had insisted on driving Sarah and Ellie to Pierce Innovations for her first day, Mr. Nguyen proudly behind the wheel of his well-maintained, older model Toyota. New beginning, Mrs. Nguyen said, patting Sarah's hand as they pulled up to the gleaming building. You work hard, make good life for baby. Thank you, Sarah said, her throat tight with emotion. These near strangers had shown her more support than she'd received from anyone since returning from deployment, for everything. The company's daycare center exceeded Sarah's expectations. Bright, clean rooms staffed by caregivers with warm smiles and gentle hands. The director, a no-nonsense woman named Miss Patton, took Sarah's detailed instructions about Ellie's schedule and preferences without judgment. Military mom? She asked, noting Sarah's precise documentation of feeding times and nap routines. Is it that obvious? Sarah asked, reluctant to leave Ellie despite the center's clear competence. I was Air Force before I went into early childhood education, Miss Patton replied with a knowing smile. We tend to run a tight ship with the little ones. Ellie will be fine, Sergeant Matthews. You can check on her any time during the day. As Sarah prepared to leave, Ellie's tiny fingers clutched at her sleeve, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her usually cheerful face. Sarah's heart constricted painfully. Mama will be back soon, sweet girl, she whispered, pressing a kiss to Ellie's forehead. I promise. The receptionist who had greeted Sarah during her interview was waiting to escort her to orientation, her smile faltering slightly at the sight of Sarah's choppy, growing-out haircut. Sarah resisted the urge to touch it self-consciously. It was just hair. It would grow back. The important thing was that Ellie had what she needed. The morning passed in a blur of paperwork, introductions, and system training. Sarah absorbed everything with the focused attention that had served her well in combat, asking precise questions and memorizing protocols. Her new colleagues were polite but curious, clearly wondering how a former Army medic with no corporate experience had landed a position directly under the CEO's Veteran Outreach Program. By lunchtime, Sarah had checked on Ellie twice, sleeping peacefully both times, and was reviewing her department's initiatives when a knock at her office door broke her concentration. David stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "How's your first day going?" "Fine," Sarah replied, equally measured. "Your HR team is efficient." An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they weren't saying. Finally, David stepped fully into the office, closing the door behind him. "I checked on Ellie this morning," he said softly, "just from the observation window. I didn't want to disrupt her routine." Something protective flared in Sarah's chest. "You should have told me you were going to do that." "You're right. I'm sorry." David's apology came without defensiveness. Surprising her, I just ... I couldn't stop thinking about her all weekend. Knowing she was in the building and not seeing her felt impossible. Sarah softened slightly, recognizing the genuine emotion in his voice. She settled in well. "The facility is impressive. I designed it with working parents in mind," David said, a hint of pride in his voice. "On-site childcare reduces stress and increases productivity. It's good business. And you just happened to implement it right before learning you had a child?" Sarah couldn't help the skepticism in her tone. David's expression faltered. "I implemented it because I saw what my VP of engineering went through, trying to balance work and family. Her babysitter quit without notice, and she nearly resigned because she couldn't find quality childcare on short notice." He paused, but maybe subconsciously ... I don't know. Maybe part of me was trying to create what I thought I could never have with you. The raw honesty in his voice caught Sarah off guard. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Miss Patton. "Ellie awake from nap, a bit fussy. Might want to check in." "I need to go to the daycare," Sarah said, rising quickly. "Ellie's upset." David stepped back. "Of course, take whatever time you need." Sarah found Ellie red-faced and whimpering in a caregiver's arms, calming slightly. At the sight of her mother, the young woman holding her looked relieved as Sarah took over. "She woke up crying," the caregiver explained. "Might be her teeth. She's been chewing on everything." Sarah nodded, cradling Ellie against her chest and swaying gently in the soothing rhythm that usually calmed her. "It's okay, baby girl. Mama's here. Is everything all right?" Sarah turned to find David hovering in the doorway, concern etched across his features. Ellie's cries immediately softened to curious whimpers as she studied this unfamiliar man with wide, tear-streaked eyes. "Teething," Sarah explained. "She gets fussy when a new one is coming in." David stepped closer, his movements cautious, as if approaching a wild animal that might spook. Ellie watched him with unmistakable interest, her father's eyes reflected in her own. "May I?" he asked quietly. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. This moment had to come sooner or later. David approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Hello, Ellie," he said, his voice gentler than Sarah had ever heard it. I'm your dad." Ellie regarded him solemnly, one fist pressed against her mouth. Then, to Sarah's surprise, she extended her other hand toward David, fingers splayed in what seemed like greeting. "She wants to touch your face," Sarah explained. "It's how she explores new people." David stepped closer, bending slightly so his face was within Ellie's reach. With delicate curiosity, she patted his cheek, his nose, his mouth leaving a trail of drool that he didn't seem to notice or mind. "She has your chin," he murmured, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. "And your expressions. The way you used to look when you were concentrating on something important. But your dimple," Sarah said softly, "and your hairline." For a moment, they were just three people connected by the gentle exploration of a baby's Hands the past temporarily set aside, the future unwritten. Then Ellie grabbed David's tie and tried to stuff it in her mouth, breaking the spell. "Sorry," Sarah said, extracting the silk fabric from Ellie's determined grip. "Everything goes straight to the mouth these days." David laughed, a genuine sound that reminded Sarah of easier times. "It's fine. I have dozens." An awkward silence fell between them, the brief moment of shared parenthood giving way to the reality of their complicated situation. "I should get back to work," Sarah said finally, "and let Ellie return to her group." "Of course." David straightened his tie, professional demeanor sliding back into place. "I have a proposition for you, though. A business dinner tomorrow night with veterans from Walter Reed who are testing our new prosthetic prototypes. Your perspective would be valuable." He hesitated. "We can arrange for childcare for Ellie, of course." Sarah considered the offer. It was work-related, appropriate within the boundaries she'd established. And yet, the thought of leaving Ellie with strangers in the evening made her uneasy. "I appreciate the opportunity, but I don't leave Ellie with sitters at night yet," she said. "She gets anxious in new environments after dark." David nodded, disappointment flashing briefly across his face before an idea seemed to strike him. "What if you both came? We're having it at my home, plenty of space for Ellie to rest if needed. My housekeeper loves children and could help while you're in the meeting portion." The suggestion was reasonable, professional enough to maintain their agreed-upon boundaries, yet offering a solution to her childcare concerns. Still, Sarah hesitated. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Thank you for the invitation." As she settled Ellie back with her caregivers and returned to her office, Sarah couldn't shake the image of David's face when he first held their daughters. Gaze a mixture of wonder. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Regret. And something that looked remarkably like love. It complicated the neat box she'd tried to place him in, the callous ex who had abandoned her when she needed him most. People were never just one thing, she reminded herself. She had been both a healer and a soldier, a victim and a survivor. Perhaps David could be both the man who left and the father who wanted to stay. David's home was not what Sarah had expected. She'd braced herself for a sleek, sterile penthouse all chrome and glass, the kind of showplace featured in business magazines. Instead, the town car dropped her and Ellie at a renovated brownstone in a tree-lined neighborhood, its warm brick exterior softened by window boxes filled with hardy winter greenery. "This is it?" Sarah asked the driver as he helped her with Ellie's diaper bag and the portable playpen she'd insisted on bringing. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Pierce prefers living closer to the ground, as he puts it." The driver smiled. Said he spent enough time with his head in the clouds at work. Sarah adjusted Ellie on her hip, smoothing down the little girl's dress. Another second-hand find, but clean and free of stains for this important meeting. She'd spent precious minutes that morning attempting to tame her own growing-out hair, which had reached the awkward stage where it stuck out in uneven tufts despite her best efforts. The front door opened before she could ring the bell, revealing not David but an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair and a no-nonsense expression that softened immediately at the sight of Ellie. "You must be Sarah, and this little princess must be Ellie," the woman said warmly. "I'm Rosa, Mr. Pierce's housekeeper. Come in before you catch cold, both of you." The interior was surprisingly homey, hardwood floors softened with area rugs. Comfortable-looking furniture arranged for conversation rather than display, walls lined with bookshelves. It looked lived in, personal in a way Sarah hadn't associated with the man David had become. "David is finishing a call in his office," Rosa explained, leading them through to a spacious kitchen that smelled of something savory and delicious. "The other guests will arrive in about an hour. Can I get you anything? Tea? Coffee?" "Water is fine, thank you," Sarah replied. her military alertness taking in exit routes and potential hazards out of habit. "Is there somewhere I can set up Ellie's playpen?" Rosa gestured to a sunroom adjacent to the kitchen. "I prepared a space for the little one. There's a monitor so you can keep an eye on her during dinner." The sunroom had been child-proofed with remarkable thoroughness, electrical outlets covered, sharp corners padded, a soft blanket spread across the floor with age-appropriate toys arranged in inviting groups. It looked like a nursery catalog photo, and Sarah felt a pang of inadequacy thinking of the makeshift play area in her basement apartment. "When did you have time to set all this up?" she asked, setting Ellie down to explore a colorful stacking. "Toy. Mr. Pierce had everything delivered yesterday," Rosa replied with a knowing smile. "Stayed up half the night researching what an 8-month-old needs. He wanted it to be perfect." The thought of David Pierce, CEO and industry titan, anxiously researching baby toys and safety measures was oddly humanizing. Sarah watched as Ellie crawled determinedly toward a soft fabric book, her tiny face alight with discovery. "You have a beautiful daughter," Rosa said quietly. "She has his eyes." Sarah tensed. "You know, I've worked for Mr. Pierce since before." "The company took off," Rosa replied. "I recognize that expression when she concentrates." The same little furrow between the brows. She touched Sarah's arm lightly. "He was lost when he came back without you. Threw himself into work like a man running from something." Before Sarah could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. "Sarah, Rosa said you'd arrived." David appeared. In the doorway, jacket discarded and sleeves rolled up, looking more like the graduate student she'd once known than the polished CEO she'd encountered in his office. His eyes immediately found Ellie on the floor, a soft smile spreading across his face. "She likes the book," he observed, hanging back as if uncertain of his welcome in this maternal sphere. "She's always been drawn to bright colors," Sarah replied, watching as Ellie babbled happily to herself, tiny fingers exploring the crinkly pages. "The child-proofing is comprehensive." "I might have gone overboard," David admitted, a hint of sheepishness breaking through his usual confidence. "But better safe than sorry, right?" An awkward silence fell, broken only by Ellie's contented noises. 3 days working at Pierce Innovations had given Sarah new insight into David's professional persona, focused, brilliant, demanding but fair. This more uncertain version of him, watching his daughter with barely concealed longing, was harder to reconcile with her anger. "The veterans will be here soon," David said finally. 3 former combat medics like yourself, all using our prosthetic prototypes. I thought you might relate to their experiences, help us understand what we're missing in our designs." Sarah nodded, professional mode engaging. "I'd be happy to offer my perspective." "And afterward," David added carefully, "maybe we could talk about arrangements for Ellie, about everything." Before Sarah could respond, Ellie let out a frustrated wail, having dropped her toy just out of reach. Both parents moved simultaneously to help, colliding awkwardly in their haste. "Sorry," David murmured, stepping back to let Sarah retrieve the toy. "It's fine," she replied, handing the book back to Ellie, who immediately brightened. "And yes, we should talk later." The arrival of the veteran guests shifted the atmosphere from personal to professional. David introduced Sarah as the new director of veteran outreach and former combat medic, making no mention of their personal connection. The 3 men, too, with prosthetic legs, one missing his left arm below the elbow, greeted her with the immediate camaraderie of those who had served. Sarah Matthews stood in front of a high-end wig boutique, her fingers trembling around a wad of cash worth more than all her possessions combined. 6 inches of her once beautiful auburn hair gone sold to feed her starving baby. What she didn't know was that her sacrifice would lead her straight back to the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. Now a powerful CEO, who wouldn't recognize the hollow-cheeked woman she had become, Preparing and narrating this type of story took US long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The January wind sliced through Sarah's thin jacket as she hurried down the cracked sidewalk. The envelope of cash clutched tightly against her chest. The weight of the money felt strange. $200 that would keep her and Ellie fed for another 2 weeks if she stretched every dollar until it screamed. Her hand instinctively rose to touch her hair, now cropped unevenly at her ears, the shortest it had been since basic training. The phantom weight of her missing locks made her head feel unnaturally light, exposed to the biting cold. 6 months. Back from her 3rd deployment, and this was what her service had earned her standing in line at discount grocery stores, counting pennies while her 8-month-old daughter wailed with hunger at home. The VA benefits were tied up in paperwork, her disability claim for the shrapnel still embedded near her spine, under review, and her military training somehow didn't translate to civilian jobs that would accommodate a single mother with no support system. Sarah's throat tightened as she passed the baby food aisle, loading her basket with the formula that Ellie's sensitive stomach could tolerate, the expensive kind that consumed half her budget, but was the only one that didn't make her baby scream in pain all night. She added rice cereal, pureed vegetables, and the cheapest diapers on the shelf, mentally calculating the total with each item. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, a mantra from her days navigating minefields in Afghanistan. One step at a time. Survive today, worry about tomorrow when it comes. The cashier, a teenager with bright blue hair and kind eyes, glanced at Sarah's choppy haircut, but said nothing as she scanned the baby items. Sarah felt naked, exposed as if everyone could see what she had done, could read the desperation in her shorn locks. Military? The cashier finally asked, nodding at the faded combat boots Sarah still wore, the only winter footwear she owned. "Army. Combat medic," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. She spoke to so few people these days, just Ellie, who responded with gurgles and cries. "My brother's in the Marines." "Thank you for your service," the girl said with genuine warmth, sliding the receipt across the counter. Sarah nodded, unable to explain how hollow those words rang when she was selling pieces of herself to feed her child. Outside the store, wet snow began to fall, melting on contact with the dirty sidewalk. Sarah tucked the groceries into her worn backpack, zipping her jacket up to her chin. 3 more blocks to the basement apartment she rented from an elderly Vietnamese couple who watched Ellie when Sarah picked up odd jobs cleaning houses or restocking shelves at night. Mrs. Nguyen opened the door before Sarah could find her key, the sound of Ellie's cries spilling out into the cold afternoon. "She miss Mama," Mrs. Nguyen said, bouncing the red-faced infant in her arms. "Won't take bottle from me. Too stubborn like you." Sarah dropped her backpack and reached for her daughter, feeling the familiar rush of love and guilt as Ellie's cries immediately softened against her chest. The baby's tiny fingers reached up, searching for the long hair that was no longer there to grasp. "I know, baby girl." "Mama looks different," Sarah murmured, pressing her lips to Ellie's forehead. "But we'll eat tonight. That's what matters." Mrs. Nguyen's eyes widened as she noticed Sarah's hair for the first time. "Ah, Sarah, your beautiful hair. "It'll grow back," Sarah said firmly, though something inside her crumbled at the pity in the older woman's eyes. "Hair grows. Babies need to eat." Mrs. Nguyen shook her head sadly. "You come upstairs for dinner tonight. Mr. Nguyen make pho. Too cold for you down here." Sarah wanted to refuse. Pride was one of the few things she had left, but the thought of a hot meal she didn't have to prepare while balancing Ellie on her hip was too tempting. "Thank you. We'd like that." Inside her small apartment, Sarah sat on the edge of her fold-out couch, feeding Ellie the formula that had cost her hair. The baby's eyes, so like her father's, gazed up trustingly as she sucked eagerly at the bottle. "You're the only good thing he ever gave me," Sarah whispered, tracing Ellie's perfect eyebrows with her fingertip. David Pierce. 4 years together, including her first 2 deployments. He'd promised to wait, promised forever. Then she'd come home from Afghanistan with shrapnel in her back, nightmares that woke her screaming, and a positive pregnancy test. 2 weeks later, he was gone a note on the kitchen counter about needing space and not being ready for this. No forwarding address, his phone disconnected. As if he could simply erase her from his life, Sarah's phone buzzed a text from her caseworker at the VA. Possible job opportunity through Veterans Program. Business looking for receptionist. Interview tomorrow 9 a.m. at Pierce Innovations downtown. Professional dress required. Sarah stared at the message, her heart skipping. Pierce Innovations, it couldn't be. Pierce was a common name, she reasoned. And David had been a struggling business student when she'd known him, not a CEO with his own company. Still, something cold settled in her stomach. She typed back a quick confirmation, then glanced at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. Her once vibrant hair now resembled a choppy boyish cut, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the dark circles under her eyes. Her only professional outfit was her army dress uniform, now hanging 2 sizes too large on her frame. "What do you think, Ellie? Can Mama pull off this new look for a job interview?" she asked, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The baby cooed in response, blowing bubbles with her formula. Sarah's phone buzzed again, a follow-up text with a website link to learn more about the company. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tapped the link, watching as the sleek, professional website loaded on her cracked screen, and there he was, David Pierce, CEO and founder, smiling confidently at the camera in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her entire apartment. The same dimpled smile, the same dark eyes that stared up at her from Ellie's tiny face every day. The man who had walked away without looking back was now apparently a success story. While she was selling her hair to feed their child, Sarah felt the room tilt, her breath coming in short gasps. How had this happened? The David she knew had been struggling through business school, full of big ideas but short on follow-through. Had leaving her somehow freed him to become ... this. Ellie squirmed in her arms, sensing her mother's distress. Sarah forced herself to breathe deeply, the way her therapist at the VA had taught her to manage panic attacks. "It's okay, baby girl," she whispered, though nothing felt okay. "Mama's just surprised, that's all." She scrolled through the website, learning that Pierce Innovations specialized in medical technology, including prosthetics for wounded veterans. The irony burned in her throat. He was profiting from helping veterans while his own child's mother, a combat veteran herself, was destitute. Sarah closed the browser and set her phone down, trying to think clearly through the shock. She had 2 choices: decline the interview and continue struggling, or face David tomorrow and ... what? Beg for a job? Demand child support? Show him what his abandonment had reduced her to? Pride warred with practicality as she gently laid Ellie in her second-hand crib. The baby's eyelids were already drooping, tiny fists relaxing as sleep claimed her. "I'd sell more than my hair for you," Sarah promised softly. "I'd give everything." That night, after a warm meal with the new-ins that temporarily filled the hollow in her stomach, Sarah stood under the lukewarm spray of her shower, working cheap conditioner through her choppy hair. Tomorrow she would come face to face with the man who had broken her heart and left her to face motherhood alone. Would he recognize her? The woman he had left had been strong, confident, with flowing auburn hair he'd loved to run his fingers through. The woman in the mirror now was a shadow, all sharp edges and wary eyes, her hair a testament to how far she had fallen. Sarah adjusted the water temperature, wincing as it suddenly turned icy, a common occurrence in the old building. As she reached for her towel, Her fingers brushed against the rough scar tissue on her lower back. A permanent souvenir from the IED that had nearly killed her and 3 members of her unit.